We are continuing our look at some of the backgrounds of early modern literature and culture, and the next phenomenon that we want to take a look at is humanism. Now, 14th and 15th century Italian humanism originally was an attempt to reintroduce classical standards of Latin composition. So it's closely connected to the idea of the Renaissance as a re-emergence of interest in classical antiquity, but here this is more focused on education. So to go back to these Latin classics and use them as a basis for education. So study and imitation of classical authors, learning Latin and Greek, and by reviving classical rhetoric, so the science of speaking. Humanism had a large impact on its time. Humanism turned into a dynamic cultural program, influencing almost every facet of Renaissance intellectual life. It was an important intellectual motive force for the Italian Renaissance. And in the later 15th century, some Englishmen, like other Northern Europeans, traveled to Italy to acquire the new humanist learning. So again, this is something that starts in Italy, and then as people move there and take up that kind of knowledge, they bring it back to England with a slight delay. So in the early 16th century, also famous continental humanists like Erasmus and Vives went to England, spent time in England, and brought these ideas over there. Thomas More, whose most famous work, Utopia, was composed originally in a witty neoclassical Latin, was of course the most internationally famous English humanist, and I'll be talking about him in a minute a little bit more. But the immediate impact was mainly on education. So humanism brought the foundation of schools, like for example St. Paul's School in 1509, or Corpus Christi College, Oxford, 1517. So this is really the beginning of a new form of education. We have to imagine how the situation of education before the advent of humanism, and there basically you had two options. One was courtly education, private education. So for those upper class aristocratic people, they would get the education that is adequate to their original social status. So you were educated to fulfill the role that you had in life. So basically, what we would now call education was really reserved for the upper classes, and that was done in private. There was no formalized method or places. Or you had monastic education, which was of course controlled by the church, was limited in focus, and was rather withdrawn from the world. This wasn't about worldly knowledge, but obviously all about religious knowledge and rather moving away from the world. So the schools that were lost with the dissolution of the monasteries, once we have the Reformation going on also in England, and many of the monasteries are being closed, but those schools that are being lost were then replaced by newly established town grammar schools. And these grammar schools were, I mean, the name grammar school comes from the fact that they're teaching Latin grammar, and they're given a humanist curriculum. So the students, pupils would read all of these texts. And Shakespeare went to one of those schools. This is actually Shakespeare's original school in Stratford. So you might have heard of these rather stupid debates about the authorship of Shakespeare, with people arguing that someone who comes from a relatively low social position, like Shakespeare does, how could he know all of these things? How could he write all of these plays with such a breadth of knowledge? And the easiest explanation is that he went to school, unlike generations before him who would not have had that privilege. So this humanist education is also connected to to power in a way. We have already looked in the earlier video at Holbein's The Ambassadors, and I tried to point out that the two men there have gained their eminence less through family influence, through inheritance, but rather through their education, and that was emphasized by all these objects that we could find in the book. So in the Tudor courts, the power resided not so much with the hereditary barons as with the university-educated men of the middling sort. So people who came from the Middle Ranges, but who were proficient in these arts and sciences, and therefore rose to prominence. One example of this is the man that you can see here. This is Thomas Cromwell. Please don't confuse him with Oliver Cromwell, the leader of the Puritan faction in the Civil Wars 100 years later. This is Thomas Cromwell, who rose to eminence and became an influential figure at the court of Henry VIII. Has been relatively obscure for a while, but he came to prominence in more recent retellings. In Hilary Mantel's series of novels, starting with Wolf Hall in 2009. So these are by now 3 historical novels that talk about the rise of Cromwell, but also Thomas More, and that have also been turned into a TV series. So education came to be seen as a requirement for political influence, both at the national and at a local level. And one important aspect of this, or part of this curriculum, was, of course, rhetoric. That's how people were being taught to become public speakers and to wield influence, political influence, but also others. So humanist training in arguing and speaking enabled a person to be heard in public debate and taught them the form and the content of what the elite social group would regard as persuasive speech. Now, we might ask ourselves, what does that have to do with literature? What we can find in early modern literature is even in genres like poetry, an increased emphasis on rhetoric and on persuasive rhetoric. We'll talk more about Petrarchan love poetry in a different video, but here I just want to show you this beginning of Philip Sidney's first sonnet in the Astrophil and Stella sequence, where we can see that this is all about basically how to do things with words, how to convince and move the world with words. Loving in truth, and fain in verse my love to show, that the dear she might take some pleasure of my pain. Pleasure might cause her read, reading might make her know, knowledge might pity win, and pity grace obtain. I sought fit words to paint the blackest face of woe. So we can see how he wants to achieve an effect with his words, and he needs to find the right words. This is basically what rhetoric is all about. As I said, the most famous document of humanism in England is Thomas More's text Utopia. We could call it a novel. We could just call it a utopia because it gives the name to the whole genre. More is an interesting figure. Certainly, he was intricately tied to the religious and to the political turmoil of the 16th century in England. He wrote humanist, polemical, spiritual works, both in Latin and in English, and thereby contributed to the development of the vernacular. He was a lawyer, he was a politician, he was a humanist, he was a statesman. For 2.5 years, he was actually Lord Chancellor at Henry's court. And he's also an example of how dangerous it was to take part in these power politics in the court of Henry VIII, because he was actually executed on grounds of high treason when he would not consent to Henry's divorce. You know, hopefully from your history lessons, that this is the reason for Henry's original break with Rome. And Thomas More did not consent to that. He did not accept Henry as the head of the newly created Church of England, and for that he was executed. So, in the eyes of the Catholic Church, he actually died a martyr, and he was canonized by the Roman Catholic Church in 1935. So he's not only Sir Thomas More, he's actually Saint Thomas More. Originally, as I said, Utopia was written in Latin. In the translation, the full title of the book is On the Best State of a Republic and on the New Island of Utopia. So we already see many of the elements of utopian writing, that this is about imagining ideal societies or versions of ideal societies, and also that this genre imagines those ideal societies on a faraway place, in this case a new island, which you can here see depicted on the left side. So later utopias would postpone the ideal society, or then maybe the worst society, into the future, but the original utopias usually had them in a remote place. The book is divided into two parts. In the first one, there's the narrator who encounters his friend, Peter Giles, in Antwerp, and Giles introduces him to another person, and that person is Raphael Hythloday, a traveler who accompanied the Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci on his trips to America. And the trio then go on to discuss the political and the social problems of England and possible solutions. So it starts with sort of a criticism of what is, and then in the second section, Hythloday relates his experiences in Utopia. Says, well, listen, I've been to this place, and this is how it is. An island that has eradicated all social, political, and economic ills, that has found a way to this perfect society. Now, when we're looking at how More describes that perfect society, it's really puzzling, because in many respects it actually contradicts More's own positions, especially from later on in his life. One of the aspects is, for example, that there is religious toleration in Utopia. You can practice whatever your religion you want to, which is actually not really More's idea. He himself had executed people for their beliefs, and then in the end he was executed for his belief. So that's puzzling, that we find this toleration and this liberal-minded spirit in the book, and not so much in his biography. So in this way, and in many other ways, Utopia is a document of the many competing, often even contradictory discourses that shaped the 16th century. These unresolved tensions between religion, the new sciences, between classical ideals, and contemporary political realities. We can find this indicated, amongst other things, in More's use of names. Now, of course, Utopia, the title of the book and of the genre, comes from the Greek. Topos is a place, and the U usually means no or none. So Utopia is a non-place. It's an imaginary place, after all. It's a place that doesn't really exist. But if we pronounce Utopia in English, it sounds like Utopia. It could also be written as EU, Utopia, and that would mean the good place. So this is at the same time a non-place and a good place. So we see sort of the ambiguity here in this description. Another way that More indicates the ambivalence in what he describes is by the name of this traveler who tells us about Utopia, and that's Raphael Hythloday, a very strange name. Now, Raphael, of course, refers to the angel Raphael, who is the one who cures blindness, so who makes us see and see the truth, whereas Hythlodaeus is Greek and means dispenser of nonsense. So this traveler at the same time makes us see the truth and tells us nonsense, and it's up to us to make up our minds. And I think that this is really why not only is this an interesting text, but it's indicative of this period where questions start to emerge, and questions that are not immediately answered in a very affirmative way, but that actually rather open up a debate. Now, humanism obviously covers what we in university education nowadays would call the humanities. So these social cultural sciences, but at the same time, there also emerged what we now would call the natural sciences, and what has been referred to as the new science. So a broad development and in scientific thinking, something that has also been called the scientific revolution, that began in Europe towards the end of the Renaissance era and that continued through the late 18th century, influencing the intellectual and social movement known as the Enlightenment, which we'll see and talk about much more later on. This is captured, for example, by books like Nicolaus Copernicus's De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres, this text that sort of readjusted our understanding of the world and the cosmos, but also books like Andreas Vesalius' De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body. So investigations into the material world, into the physical world, are at the forefront of the new sciences. According to Galileo Galilei, the core of what came to be known as the scientific method is stated in his book Il Saggiatore to be the concept of a systematic mathematical interpretation of experiments and empirical facts. Galileo writes, philosophy, that is what we will now call physics, is written in this grand book, I mean the universe, which stands continually open to our gaze. But it cannot be understood unless one first learns to comprehend the language and interpret the characters in which it is written. It is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles, and other geometrical figures, without which it is humanly impossible to understand a single word of it. Without these, one is wandering around in a dark labyrinth. In a way, this could be said to be the point at which literature, which we might call the investigation into the imaginable, into that which is thinkable, in which literature and science, as an investigation into the observable, start to dissect and to drift apart. Galileo, when he says we need to, when he calls nature a book that is to be read, he also emphasizes that this is a different language, and this language is mathematical. It's not linguistic. So from this point on, these two disciplines will start to drift apart. Of course, there's no direct and complete separation. For a long time, rather the positive influence of science and scientific thinking will be much more pronounced on literature. We will talk much more when we look at the 18th century at the emergence of realist narratives, and that is very strongly influenced by this emphasis on the observable, on the empirically given. It will first become a problem in religio ethical terms when scientific accounts of the world start to collide with biblical accounts, and it will really come in to a crisis point, to a first crisis point in Romanticism, when Romantic authors reject a view of the world which they see as too cold, too analytical, and against which they will hold poetry and the arts. But here we can basically sort of see the point where this starts to split in a way. Under the influence of scientists and philosophers like Francis Bacon, whom you can see here, a sophisticated empirical tradition was developed in the 16th century. So this is something we see throughout the 16th century, and Bacon is one of the figureheads of this development. Also someone who founded a lot of the methods that characterize this scientific revolution and this new form of thinking, and that was based on the inductive method. So an inductive approach to nature, which abandons assumptions. You don't assume anything before you actually start to look, and to attempt to simply observe with an open mind. So you find knowledge by looking at that which is observable. And that was in strict opposition to and strict contrast to the earlier Aristotelian approach of deduction, by which analysis of known fact produced further understanding. So I know this and I know that already, and if I combine these, I can generate new knowledge. Basically without even looking at the world, and Bacon turned that around and says, no, we need to look at the world, we need to observe without any kind of preconceived knowledge, and that basically is at the core of this scientific revolution, and also something that will revolutionize how literature conceives of its connection to reality. Bacon was also a writer, an important writer. He wrote down his ideas of the scientific method in several works, particularly here this one, The Advancement and Proficience of Learning, Divine and Human, from 1605. A pioneering essay in support of empirical philosophy, and also, of course, New Atlantis, another utopian text from 1627, a vision of the future of human discovery and knowledge, expressing his aspiration and his ideals for humankind. And this is a text that many decades, if not centuries before it actually came to pass, already envisioned what we would call the modern research university, so a university like the one that we are in at the moment. In the next step, we want to look at how politics influenced the culture and the literature of their times, and this of course ties into what we said at the very beginning about the political start of this era. Because as you remember, this is the era of the Tudor dynasties. So the Tudors were the first kings and queens to, as we might call it, extensively use public relation efforts in their project of establishing themselves and their royal authority, and to establish that as part of their identity. So remember the House of Tudor that emerged out of the Wars of the Roses in 1485, and that then reigned for more than 100 years. And this is the series of kings and queens that formed the House of Tudors. So this end of the War of the Roses not only brought an end to the bloodshed and to the violence, but it also changed the political setup in England, because it brought a concentration of power onto the court, in contrast to the higher aristocracy all around England. So this is more of an understanding of absolutist power that we have. But this absolutist power is not yet securely grounded in a clear lineage, because it only emerges out of this war, and it emerges out of the act of deposing of a legitimate king, after all. So monarchs need to create the right image of themselves, and this of course becomes even more important as Henry VIII breaks with Catholic Europe and becomes head of the Church of England with the English Reformation. So here it becomes even more important to legitimize this claim to be the head of the state and to be the head of the religion. As we saw, Thomas More opposed this idea and was beheaded for this. And these efforts to legitimize monarchical power and to create the notion of an absolute monarch also help to form what we nowadays understand as a national identity, the identity of being an Englishman, and that was contained, of course, not in the people yet, but rather in the monarch. We can see a very nice visual illustration of this idea that the nation is not represented by the people, but by the monarch who contains the people. When we look at a slightly later text, Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, so this book of political theory from the middle of the 17th century. And this is the original title page of the book, and if we zoom in to this, one thing that you can see here, of course, is that the body of the monarch who looms above the city, and the body of the monarch is consisting of his people. So it's the physical body of the monarch contains these other bodies. And we see this here as well as in different representation. Now in this case it is Queen Elizabeth, and she contains here these different spheres of the public, and she represents the Sphera Civitatis, so the public sphere. And there was actually the sort of this political theory that the monarch has two bodies, a body natural and a body politic. So a body that is more symbolic, representational. And this, of course, has two important aspects. The monarch has this representative body and or identity, that is an identity that is there to be perceived by a public. And what that means is that strategies of representation become important. If your purpose is to be seen and to represent something, then of course the way that you represent yourself, the way that you actually show yourself to the world or create an image of yourself becomes important. And in fact, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I are all masters of self-representation. In a speech, Elizabeth at one point argued against Parliament's demand that her sister Mary be arraigned in the bar and tried by a jury. And she said, you can't do this, because her position, Mary's position as queen, prohibited it. And she explained it in these words: "We princes, I tell you, are set on stages, in the sight and view of all the world duly observed." So it's interesting that she uses basically a term from a literary metaphor, the stage, to explain political power. So if political power is explained in a metaphor, then maybe it is best represented through art. And this is something that we find in the courts of particularly Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, that they use artists, we might call it instrumentalize artists, for their own representational purposes. We can, for example, look at Elizabeth and pictorial representations. There are numerous portraits of Elizabeth, and they're never just realist, naturalist portraits of the Queen, but they're also they're all heavily symbolic. We have, for example, here the early paintings of the princess and of the young Queen. We can take a look at these beautiful portraits for a second. Then later on, when she becomes queen and continues to refuse to marry, that's kind of a bit of a political problem, of course, because in this way she won't produce an heir. So she needs to kind of make a justification for this. So we have a series of paintings that represent her as the Virgin Queen, and you see that by this symbol, by what she's wearing in her hands here. And this is a reference to a classical Roman story, the story of Tucha, a Vestal virgin, who proved her chastity by carrying a sieve full of water from the Tiber River to the temple of Vesta without spilling a drop. So this is a clear reference and is a clear way to legitimize this idea that she is the Virgin Queen and that she doesn't need a husband and that she doesn't need to produce children. Other paintings are rather representations of political power. We can see this very clearly in the so-called Armada portrait of 1588. This is after the Spanish have made an attempt to invade England with the Spanish Armada, and you can see here in the left picture, this is the Spanish Armada arriving. And what happened is that they came into a very great storm, and a lot of the ships actually sank before they even could reach England. And this is represented here in the other window, where you can see the storm and the ships sinking. And of course, you see how Elizabeth has her hand firmly on the globe. So this emphasizes England's political aspirations to become also a colonial power and to expand power there. You remember that also the ambassadors had an image of a globe in the background. And finally, this is another representation of political power that basically aims for even higher things, in that now you can see that Elizabeth here is sort of the dividing line between a sunny sky and a thunderstorm that is behind her. So she is actually representative of almost an eternal sphere of political power and peace and prosperity. And again, she's standing here on the world, emphasizing her political power. So we see how art is being used and is necessary to maintain and to create this idea of a benign, of a justified, of a legitimate kingship, or in this case, queenship. But of course, it's not just painting that is being used by these kings and queens, but also literature. Authors, writers are being put into the service of this kingly representation. And maybe the best example of this is this long poem, The Faerie Queene, poem by Edmund Spenser. That was originally published. The first part was published in 1590, and then a second part was published in 1596. So you can see that it's a very substantial work that took him quite a while to write. In its construction, the Faerie Queene is clearly allegorical, and it's clearly meant to be allegorical. Its allegory encompasses a humanist attempt to represent the perfect human virtues in poetical images. So it's based on the humanist curriculum. It's based on the virtues that are represented by that, and it tries to sketch these in poetical forms. In a letter to Sir Walter Raleigh that is prefixed to the 1590 edition of the first three books, Spenser writes that the general end of all the book is to fashion a gentleman or noble person in virtue and gentle discipline. So it's also kind of a didactic work that teaches us to be good and noble and virtuous by showing us these persons. So for this reason, several knights are depicted that represent different virtues, and we go on adventure basically with these knights, and then they can prove and develop their virtues. So this is this provides kind of the storytelling material, but of course all of this this general allegory is tied to an allegorical representation of the Queen, because in that Faerie Queen, which is sort of the center of power of this construct, as he writes in his dedication, I mean glory in my general intention, but in my particular, I conceive the most excellent and glorious person of our sovereign, the Queen and her kingdom in fairyland. So he makes very clear in the dedication that by the Faerie Queen, Elizabeth is meant. And it is this Queen is the political guarantee for a social situation, in this case the court, in which these virtues can develop. So it's only through the Queen as the center and as the guarantee of a social structure that these knights can develop their virtues. So very clearly a way to justify and to legitimate this central power of the monarch. If we describe it like this, it maybe sound overly schematic or even formulaic, but like many other Renaissance works, this as well contains unresolved tensions within it that derive from two main sources in this case. One of the sources is Sidney's own growing dissatisfaction with the development of Elizabeth's monarchy. So we find as the work progresses, and as you saw, there's two parts that are published 6 years apart, the poem starts to contain not just this glorification of the Faerie Queen, but also veiled criticisms of the Queen. So this is one thing, that he starts out in this very congratulatory mode, but then starts to become dissatisfied and more critical. And the other thing is, of course, that his poetical talents kind of take over the allegory. The artistic development of his poetic language and of the epic narrative as he creates them transcend the original goals. Indeed, in the face of poetry of the order that Spencer writes, the attempt to extract from this truly enormous poem, I have to admit, it's a very, very long poem, but to extract from that a simple allegorical correspondence, of course, can only become irrelevant. There is so much more than this original thing. So the moral purposes that he declared in this letter to Raleigh no doubt provided him with the starting point for a work that was certainly intended to advance deeply held moral convictions. But as we read, we find our awareness of the moral framework giving a way to a surrender of the poetry. So this original constricting framework is expanded through the way that he describes this and becomes much more. And this is certainly a take-home point for all of our reading of literature, of literary history, that social circumstances are often important to understand, particularly the origin of literature, but that we usually remember pieces of literature for transcending these circumstances, for going beyond these circumstances and saying us something that is not tied and restricted to them. And finally, I want to tie this all the way back to literature proper and the writing and the publishing of books. So here again you see the first edition of the Faerie Queene. Obviously it's a printed book, and it has the dedication here, which you can see here, which also uses sort of typographical structures to represent this vast body that the vast political body that the Queen represents. So what we can see here is that printed books through their physical form, through their material form, also emphasize this representational nature. In this case, of course, through the dedication to an aristocrat. But if we look a little bit further, we can see that writers themselves started to represent themselves and their works in these terms. So if we go on a little bit further to 1616, we can see that this is the edition of a collected edition of Ben Jonson's plays, and just look at this title page. You can see that what we see here is basically like a monument. A monument is usually reserved for a person of political or religious eminence, but here this monument literally stands for literary texts, and that was a very, very new and revolutionary thing. Johnson was a little bit younger than Shakespeare, is the first to present his theatrical works in such a way. You might know, and I will talk more about this, that Shakespeare actually never in his own lifetime published his poetical works, his theatrical works. He did publish or had published his poems, but theater plays were not considered to be of high enough esteem to be published. So this, what Johnson does here is that he uses these strategies of representation and then applies them to himself as a writer. And then shortly after that, but after Shakespeare's death, comes the first collected edition of Shakespeare's plays, the first folio that has an image of the author on the title page. So all of these show us that writers are being used by politics to create these representational image, but then go on also to create their own images and to create representations of their own works.